Morning. If we could all please take our seats. I now have the pleasure of introducing our soloist, Dion Schaffner.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How are you all feeling today? Good. So I'd like to invite you all to sing with me. I'm pretty sure everybody knows this song that I'm about to do. So when I simply sing, "What's going on?" I want you to sing, "What's going on?" Is that all right? Can we practice? What's going on? What's going on? Oh, what's going on? What's going on? Good. Y'all sound good. Y'all some singers. And you can clap and sing along, snap your fingers. If it feels good, do it. All right? Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. You know we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Oh, picket lines and picket signs. Don't punish me, sing resist you brutality. Come on, talk to me so you can see. Oh, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Come on, put your hands together. Yeah. Mother, 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 everybody thinks we're wrong. Oh, but who were they to judge us? Simply 'cause our hair is long. Come on. You know we've got to find a way to bring some understanding here today. Oh, picket lines and picket signs. Don't punish me with brutality. Come on, talk to me so you can see what's going on. Oh, what's going on? Hey, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Come on, sing it, what's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Yeah, what's going on?
Can you please join me in another round of applause for that amazing performance by Dion Faulkner? Good morning, and welcome to the 45th Annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration. My name is Jennifer Mariedo, and I will be your Master of Ceremony for this celebration. I am the daughter of immigrant parents. I am a proud Colombiana, and I will, in 3 months, 24 days, and a few hours, give or take, go from being a student of this institute to a graduate. I was honored to be chosen to be today's MC for this event because I strongly believe that the words that Dr. King spoke of over 50 years ago are still so relevant to all people of color today. So we need to come together. We need to start fighting for each other and standing up for one another because they can ignore one of us, but they can't ignore all of us. I now have the pleasure of introducing Reverend Boswell Ford and Rabbi Fisher, who will lead us in this morning's invocation.
Please join with us and stand as you are able for the invocation. My ancestors arrived in this nation in chains, pressed face to back in the dark, airless bottoms of slave vessels. My ancestors were also those who forged the chains and captained those ships. My forefathers and foremothers rode with the wind across the great plains of this nation before it was America. Others of my forefathers and foremothers hunted those who rode with the wind, forcing them to their knees and to march along dusty trails of tears. The duality of this nation courses through my veins. I came into selfhood, cutting my teeth on resistance to oppression, realizing that this is best done within and across communities of allies.
My ancestors came to this land because the streets were paved with gold. My ancestors came to this land forced from their homes of generations because of hatred, pogroms, and genocide. My forefathers and foremothers were unable to completely escape what they fled and faced challenges and discrimination like many peoples, even in this new land of promise. My forefathers and foremothers stood with those who had also been identified as other, joining together with one accord in their cause, leading their voices to the fight for justice, freedom, and equality.
Together, we and all of you gathered under the sound of our voices represent the pain
And the promise
of this still great
yet flawed
nation. We gather in this space knowing that it is only through collaboration and mutuality that we can ensure that the promise is met and that the Bank of Justice will one day serve each and every one of us.
We gather in this space realizing that it is only through love that our common humanity is affirmed and the beloved community is constructed.
In King's words, we speak of a love that is not sentimental or affectionate. It is an understanding, a redeeming goodwill for all, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return.
Let us embody that love.
Let us build up this community, starting here today. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Boswell Ford and Rabbi Fisher. Now, in the spirit of this celebration, we invite you to greet, meet, or shake hands with someone near you, at your table, or across from you. We are excited about today's event and are happy that you are here to share it with us. I would like to take this moment to thank President Rafael Reif and Christine Reif, our honored hosts for this morning. I would also like to thank our honored guest and keynote speaker, Reverend Rahsaan Hall, Director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. Last night, Last night, at a special dinner, the MLK Junior Leadership Award winners were honored. We are very pleased to recognize these individuals and groups who embody the ideals of Dr. King in service to their community. Today, I would like to share with the audience this year's award winners, as well as the names of the MLK visiting professors and scholars, and the names of everyone on the Martin Luther King Jr. Planning Committee. All the names I'm about to announce are in your program if you would like to follow along, and more information on each of the scholars can be found on the MLK Scholars website. Please stand up as I call your name. Audience, please hold your applause until the end. The Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award recipients: Helena Ma, Andrew Mairena, Ramona Allen, Shauna Bush-Fenty, MIT Case, Class Awareness, Support, and Equality. Now, I would like to recognize the 2018-2019 MLK visiting professors and scholars. Please stand as I call your name. Dwayne Lee, Lorja Garcia Peña, Kasu Ukuju, and Matthew Schumacher. Lastly, I would like to thank all the members of the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Subcommittee of the Presidential Committee on Race and Diversity, to whom we owe this wonderful event. Committee members include Asia Adams Heath, co-chair, Zena Queen, co-chair, Gabrielle Ballard, Dextina Booker, Narissa Clark, Sharon Clark, Catherine Gammon, Daria Johnson, Heather Konar, Deborah Liverman, Caesar McDowell, Paul Paravano, Christine Reif, honorary member, Nyasha Toloy, and Toby Weiner. Thank you all for your contributing to the success. The theme for this year's celebration is fulfilling America's promissory note. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. Today we are here to celebrate the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Each year, we search the vaults for a moving and fitting quote relevant to the current state of affairs. This year, our theme is from the I Have a Dream speech, usually shrouded by highly sanitized quotes for palatable talks of diversity and progress. So as not to mince the words, we would like to share the full quote. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the great architects of our nation wrote the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on its promissory note. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vault of opportunity of this nation. So, we have come to cash our check, a check which, upon demand, will give us the riches of freedom and the security of justice. It is evident in the past few months alone that America has not fulfilled its promissory note. Whether we speak of the continued practice of police brutality of Black youth, caging children of immigrants, entangling ourselves in discussions of which bathroom a person is allowed to use, and even swastikas drawn on celebratory signs for Black History Month. We need to ask ourselves, what will we do as an institute, and more broadly, America as an institution, to open the vaults of justice and end this tradition of the further othering and discrimination of marginalized peoples? With these questions in mind, I would like to introduce two of our very own students, undergraduate Nekaya Etienne and graduate Dejan Jordan, to guide us in reflections on the life and legacy of Dr. King. We will hear first from Nekaya, followed by Dejan.
Good morning. MIT students, faculty, staff, and guests. My name is Nekaya Etienne. I am a proud Dominican woman, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and a young Black activist striving to better the lives of students of color on this campus, especially through my involvement with the Black Students Union and as an admissions ambassador. I celebrate my culture here through dance as a member of Sakata Afrique. I will be getting a degree in June in mechanical engineering. But most importantly, I am a sister of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, a strong Black woman, and a student who continues to conquer despite being here at a predominantly white institution. My family's journey, which became my journey, started before I was born, when my mom emigrated here illegally from Dominica, a small Caribbean island, to Brooklyn. My mother believed there was more here for herself and her children. Growing up, I never truly knew how much my family struggled, and my mother never chose to show it. Her priority was making sure I was educated. I remember during all 3 years of middle school, battling my mom to stay home from Saturday enrichment school. For the record, I never won. Looking back on that today, I am glad she forced me to go, because if not, I would not be standing here at MIT today. While in Brooklyn, I grew up in a Black neighborhood. My neighborhood specifically heavily consisted of Caribbean immigrants. Because of this, and because of my parents, I am fortunate enough to know a great deal of my heritage. My high school consisted of 90% Black students, with a majority of Black teachers, administrators, and staff. I was always sure, and I was always aware, I was Black, but never really knew what that meant outside of the Black community until coming to MIT. MIT was my first real experience as a member of the minority. I realized my race now meant I was one of the most visible to the eye, but also the most overlooked. In my classrooms, my face was the most memorable, but my intelligence and my input was the most shunned amongst my peers. The stereotypes that I grew up hearing about was being attached to my Blackness. When I started to think that the few friends I made through BSU and Interface Edge was all I had, I walked into my first ever My Sister's Keeper event during spring semester of my freshman year, and was astounded walking into a room full of Black women faculty, staff, and students. It was my first time at MIT where I did not feel like an outsider because of my race. Then, when we all gathered together and did the electric slide, I knew I found my home. It was then I realized the Black women at MIT were going to be my biggest cheerleaders. After that, I frequented the Office of Multicultural Programs and the Office of Minority Education a little too much, constantly seeking their guidance and love throughout my time here. My time as an undergraduate at MIT is ending. I am leaving here with significant lessons and experiences. I leave here knowing I participated in the BSU's Black Hack twice and was one of the many students in our die-in, where I laid on the floor in Lobby 7 and shed tears for all of my people who have fallen victim to police brutality. I leave here knowing that I have grown as an activist. I leave here knowing that I want to continue to touch the lives of young boys and girls who come from similar backgrounds to me, reminding them that systematic racism and stereotypes do not define their potential. My graduation is not just any graduation. The best way to explain this is by continuing to read the lines of Dr. King's speech. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Receiving a degree from MIT means I am finally cashing my check. I am cashing my check for my family who have held me on their shoulders throughout the 4 years, for the students of color in the class years below me, showing them that we are destined to walk across the stage with our degrees flying in our hands. And lastly, as a sign that obstacles and barriers cannot stop a strong Black woman on the rise. My check is an indication that the Bank of Justice is not bankrupt. I challenge everyone sitting here and all the members of the MIT community to start making it a mission and priority of yours to aid students of color towards cashing their own checks. I challenge you to take the necessary actions to move MIT towards a more equitable community. Let our voices be heard. Do not interpret the cries of students as a cry for help, but instead a call to action. I challenge you to always provide healing spaces for students of color, not only when we are affected by something in the news. You must nurture our homes and living groups instead of disbanding them and stripping away their historic culture and memories for what you think is for the betterment of our community, but in reality ruins what we as students built for each other. I challenge you to strive toward making our presence on campus the new norm. I encourage you to ask questions to gain a better understanding of our struggles within the general MIT community. We must strive to reach the dream in unison as one body and one MIT community. Thank you.
Good morning. Come on, you got to be more energized than that. Good morning. All right. My name is Dejan Jordan, and I am a graduate student in city planning here in the Department of Urban Studies. And I'll be graduating this June. But more importantly, I'm a proud New Orleanian, and I will rep my city till the day I die. Currently, I serve on the executive board of the Students of Color Committee in our department, and also recently appointed as the Graduate Community Fellow in the Office of Graduate Education Diversity Initiatives. I'd also like to take this time to thank the event organizers for all of their hard work and support, everything from the details of this venue to helping us prepare for today. So give them a round of applause. When I was first offered the honor of sharing this year's graduate student remarks, I was frankly quite shocked. Most would say I'm more like Malcolm X. And this year's theme, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt, actually seem very far from the truth right now in our country. What I came to in the end was that today we should focus on two checks: America's promissory note and social justice. From my time being raised on America Street in New Orleans, I was fortunate enough to have the values of hard work and community embedded into my psyche. Whether it's my dad's humdrum words of, "Do what you have to do so you can do what you want to do, son," or my mom's sacrifice of sleep to help me with last-minute school projects, I endlessly benefited from their love and commitment to my success. However, in that same New Orleans, I've witnessed some of the most grotesque disparities for Black people. As an organizer, I learned the immeasurable sacrifices that community leaders, business owners, and citizens endure to try to cash their own promissory notes. From the devastation of 1960s urban renewal highways to the post-Hurricane Katrina disinvestment in Black neighborhoods, these injustices, unhealed, had compounded into the issues that I work to address even while here in Cambridge. As a city planner in training, I deeply understand that the challenges of our cities don't just change because of public officials and community organizers. Knowing this, my classmates, faculty, and I grapple with the recommendations we make to nonprofits and local government, and how the tools we use either help exclude or empower people from historically marginalized backgrounds. Are we perpetuating a legacy of disenfranchisement to those communities around the country who've been decimated by those same urban renewal highways, or redlining, or explicit racial disinvestment? Are we creating spaces for those who've been unheard to be listened to, and for them to have agency over their own lives without our help? Though these efforts seem minimal, these students go on to influence the development of our world. The promissory note was not just about racial harmony and hand-holding, but Dr. King's address was explicitly about racial and economic justice. It was about people of color having their rights as American citizens activated and being able to access fair employment opportunities, housing, education, and simply the ability to provide quality lives for their families. What are we doing as a body to not only make sure that classrooms aren't just diverse and inclusive by the number of skin tones we can count, but by the content of our curriculum and our actions to prioritize equity and racial justice? We must remember that diversity and inclusion are not substitutes for justice and equity. Justice and equity should not be a suggestion here, but our collective mission. Our disciplines, though scientific, entrepreneurial, and technical, do have racial and social impact. The world is watching not only what we produce, but the values we champion and the processes we take to get there. These values and processes become the checks we deposit into America's bank as we work. The way we show up in our offices and classrooms and labs equally shape the climate of equity and justice for those around us and outside of the walls of MIT. To faculty, staff, and administrators, you are the gatekeepers of ensuring that a culture of equity and justice is maintained and welcomed. The social atmospheres you uphold and create here are foundational to the ways we behave and perpetuate systems of oppression outside of our campus. Ask yourself, do I acknowledge the missing voices of people of color, LGBTQ folks, and women from our decision-making tables? Am I making sure that student groups like the BSU feel safe to celebrate Black History Month without attack? You have the responsibility of bringing social issues of the world into our campus and literally putting money into the Bank of Justice by funding students and faculty to do the work. To students, despite popular belief in our powerlessness, mobilizing student voices has the power to shape the current and future goals of MIT. We are to follow the examples of student groups like the Black Graduate Students Association and the Black Students Union, who created a set of recommendations to the Institute to improve the academic experiences of all students of color. Our time spent advocating through student organizations and symposiums do not take away from our ability to do rigorous research in our departments. It enriches and informs the academic work we do, providing the blueprint for values to hold our workplaces accountable to. We are not choosing between academic requirements and just causes. This is preparation to show the world how things like big data, climate change, and real estate development are fundamentally issues of freedom and justice. This is our professional practice. This extends beyond typical requests to volunteer for a day at a local high school or to do some service trip abroad for a couple of weeks. You deposit money into the Bank of Justice when you deeply examine recruitment and admission processes on a department-by-department basis. To deeply examine recruitment and to deeply understand the assumptions we make about candidates who are worthy of being here. You deposit money into the Bank of Justice when you consider how the expansion of MIT makes Cambridge unaffordable for low-income residents. I am not asking members of MIT to join the protests of the streets. In fact, I simply don't expect it. However, our engagement should bring problems of racial, economic, and social injustice to the heart of our institution and our daily actions. We must all ask ourselves the hard questions and hold ourselves accountable to solving them with fierce urgency. Is racial and economic justice our priority? If so, what are we doing to promote the cashing of the promissory note that Dr. King spoke of? We are obligated to center equity and justice in every step of our technological curiosity and to ensure that MIT is the shining example of mind in hand that we profess it to be. So, like my friends would say, in the words of Malcolm X, education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs only to the people who prepare for it today. Thank you.
Thank you again, Nekaya and Dejan, for your thoughtful and perceptive remarks, and for letting the words and ideals of Dr. King be heard once more. I would now like to bring back our soloist, Dion Schaffner, who will perform another musical selection for us this morning.
This song that I'm about to sing is called If It Had Not Been for the Lord on My Side, Where Would I Be? If you know it, sing along with me. If it had not been for the Lord who was on my side, tell me where would I be? Where would I be? Said if it had not been for the Lord who was on my side, tell me where would I be? Where would I be? You see, he kept my enemies away, and he let the sun shine through a cloudy day. And he rocked me in the cradle of his arms when he knew I'd been battered and scorned. But if it had not been for the Lord who was on my side, tell me where would I be? Where would I be? Said if it had, put your hands together, not been for the Lord on my side, tell me where would I be? Oh, where would I be? Oh, if it had not been for the Lord on my side.
What a beautiful song. Thank you again, Dion. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome the 17th president of MIT, Rafael Reif, who will speak to us and then introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer, for all you're doing, and more particularly for the beautiful and most accurate pronunciation of my name. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by thanking everyone who helped to bring us together today, including our host, the Committee on Race and Diversity, the MLK Planning Committee, and the Office of the ACLU. I want to express my deep admiration to our student speakers today, our incredible student speakers. Nikaya and Dejan, you make me, and quite frankly, all of us, extremely proud. Thank you. Well, as you have heard, today's theme comes from Dr. King's most famous speech. He spoke at a moment when the nation was rocked by painful inequality and violent suppression. Yet somehow, even in the face of so much turmoil, he was hopeful. And he made it clear that to remain true to its ideals, America's Bank of Justice owes everyone the same essential guarantee of freedom and equality. Today, we obviously have not conquered discrimination, inequality, and violence. But I believe we can see some signs that the story is changing. And we can certainly see opportunities for each of us to accelerate that change. As one obvious and impressive example, let's take a moment to appreciate the fact that the US Congress is now the most diverse in our nation's history. And that is thanks to people like our own representative, Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts. Because of the perspectives and life experiences of these elected leaders, they are changing the story, and they are transforming our national debate. What's more, sometimes now, even on occasions when the old story of racism seems most obvious, we can see subtle but important signs of change. For instance, it turns out that more than one current political leader in Virginia participated in the terrible tradition of dressing in blackface. In 2019, this is painful. But even in this discouraging story, I believe there is an important thread of hope. In Dr. King's time, for powerful white men to have worn blackface back in school would have been routine. Today, fortunately, finally, it's a public outrage. I hope that together, slowly, although perhaps much too slowly, we are learning. At the same time, I want to acknowledge a recent painful event on our own campus. It was referred to this morning already by our speakers. Last week, in honor of Black History Month, the Black Students Union transformed Lobby 7 with spectacular posters and images. And then one morning, someone defaced one of the posters by drawing the shape of a large swastika. We do not know who drew it, and some words under the drawing make it difficult to be certain what they intended. But regardless, the act was disturbing. As someone who grew up in a family of refugees from Eastern Europe, I certainly and painfully feel the shock of seeing a swastika. But I must tell you, in this case, I was infinitely more impressed by how our community responded. Within minutes, the BSU students had replaced the damaged banner. Very quickly, our bias response team, including the MIT police, was on the case. And at the earliest opportunity, Vice President and Dean for Student Life, Susie Nelson, and interim ICEO Alice Johnson wrote to the community to share the facts. They offered support and they reaffirmed our values: empathy, compassion, inclusiveness, and respect for all. And right away, BSU leaders Calvin Green and Mimi Wahid wrote a letter to the tech. It included these lines: though this act of hatred disturbs us, it neither destroys us nor diminishes our power. We remain grounded in the strength of our community. To me, this represents the very best of MIT. Clearly, it's not possible to prevent every damaging act. But when we come together to support each other on our campus, we change the story for our own community. And I believe that in doing so, we help to change the larger story, too. I want to close by highlighting an important example of how the people of MIT can take action to change the story of the future in a very MIT way. I'm sure some of you know or have read about Joy Blanwini. Joy, are you here? Could you please stand up? Just a quick question. Did I royally mispronounce your last name? Okay. Joy is a graduate student. You can sit down. Joy is a graduate student, unless you want me to embarrass you while you're standing up. Is a grad student at MIT. She describes herself as a computer scientist, the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, and a poet of code. You will find her hard at work in the MIT Media Lab, that is, when she's not busy speaking on the TED stage, or participating in the World Economic Forum in Davos, or advising the Federal Trade Commission on policy. Most recently, she wrote about her work in the Optimist issue of Time magazine. The world is taking notice because Joy discovered that some facial analysis software literally could not detect her dark-skinned face as a face until she put on a white mask. She has also found that many commercially available systems tend to recognize the faces of Black women as being male. The problem stems from the fact that such systems are typically trained by using large data sets of images, primarily of light-skinned men. The result is what Joy calls algorithmic bias. And as she observes, algorithmic bias, like human bias, results in unfairness, and algorithms can spread bias on a massive scale and at a rapid pace. Today, Joy is on a campaign to reveal and to root out this kind of bias in global systems that touch all of our lives. I believe her work matters greatly on its own, and for that, I thank her. But I also take it as an inspiring reminder of how, at this moment in the history of technology, the people of MIT have a unique opportunity to make a vital difference. In 2 weeks, the Institute will celebrate the launch of the MIT Stephen A. Schwarzman College of Computing. A critical goal of the college is to educate the young people who will shape the future of artificial intelligence. We're putting ethics and societal impact at the center of that education. And I very much hope that in doing this, with the help and inspiration of Joy and many others at MIT, we can help to change the story for everyone. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Rahsaan Hall, Director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. Through a strategic combination of advocating on Beacon Hill, pursuing targeted lawsuits, and engaging people in their neighborhoods, Rahsaan works to advance racial justice in communities across the state. His experience ranges from having served as an assistant district attorney in Suffolk County to being an ordained reverend in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We're all eager to hear his perspective today, so please join me in giving a warm MIT welcome to Rahsaan Hall.
Good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, President Wright, for that warm and kind introduction and for your remarks. I'm having a bit of a fanboy moment. I didn't know Joy was going to be here. Big admirer of your work. To the planning committee and to these amazing student speakers, please give them another round of applause. See, I told Daria that, because she was working with them, I told her to make sure that they don't do better than I'm going to do. So I just say that to set your bar a little lower. You've heard the main event. I'm just here as the dessert. But thank you all for the opportunity to come and speak with you on this very special and important day. It's always an honor for me to come. I've been here several years to provide the invocation, and so I was extremely humbled when I was asked to give a keynote address because I've seen some of the folks that you all have had to come and address you on this auspicious occasion. And so I want to reflect on Dr. King's words that are the theme of this year's event, and it's been lifted up several times already. This speech that, as Jennifer, our MC, has pointed out, and I saw that you had memorized that. You didn't get an applause for it, but let's give Jennifer applause, because I don't know if you all were paying attention, but when she was reciting Dr. King's speech, she wasn't looking at her notes. She had committed that to memory, so that's a very impressive task. But in addition to being a masterful master of ceremonies, but and she had acknowledged rightly, I think, that we often receive the very sanitized version of Dr. King's speech, the very lofty and high ideals of black boys and black girls holding hands with white boys and white girls and letting freedom ring from every mountaintop till we can all join in the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. And it's very important and it's very resonant and it touches us in a very special way. But what gets glossed over and overlooked is the tension that gets created earlier on in that speech when he talks about that the Negro lives in a lonely island of poverty in midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. He talks about the conditions that black people in America were living in at that time. And when he talks and says that it's obvious today that America has defaulted on its promissory note insofar as citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation, so we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. What King did in that moment was a rhetorical maneuver that had created this tension that he would later juxtapose with these lofty, uplifting ideals. But that imagery that he used of that unpaid debt evoked Abraham Lincoln's description of the debt, which was marginally paid through the Civil War. And he gave this speech, and you can look and see there's President Lincoln there giving his second inaugural address. And I don't know, somebody said, like, this might be John Wilkes Booth up there. I don't know. You can judge for yourself. But in that speech, in talking about the war that had torn this nation apart and the reasons behind this war, he said, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, still it must be said, the judgment of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So that there was a reckoning that this country had to come face to face with, that Lincoln had believed it might not have come, and King lifted up again that it had still not come. The challenge I have with some of King's idealizing the Constitution's promise of this note, that when he said this note was a promise to all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the obvious exclusion that it was limited to men and not women, but also the reality that the drafting and origins of this document did not contemplate all humanity. It did not contemplate black people or Latinx people or queer people or non-binary people. It had to be through the toil and struggle and resistance of humanity that we had to force it to recognize that. So even though King's vision was one of hope and of high ideals, the reality is that this is a document that is imperfect and that is rooted in a system of white supremacy, and not white supremacy as people think of skinheads and neo-Nazis and the alt-right, but white supremacy as a system or structure of beliefs that center and prioritize and lift up and normalize white lives, white values, white behavior at the expense of the lives, value, property, behavior, and cultures of people of color. And so there's a certain trajectory that this nation has from its original sin of genocide of First Nation peoples, its original sin of slavery, bringing millions of Africans to enslave them here in this country, to the 13th Amendment where slavery was outlawed, but there was the specific carve-out that was left for people who had been duly convicted of a crime. It's amazing that you got the southern states to sign on for the ratification of the 13th Amendment. There was a researcher or a historian that looked through some archives and found a reporter from Kansas had gone down to the southern states to find out how the ratification process was going, and spoke to some southern legislators who all agreed that they'd be okay with the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery because there was this particular provision that was still left for them. And so So even in the aftermath of slavery and the Reconstruction era, where federal troops were sent into the South to ensure that black people could fully embrace and take hold of their agency and hold positions and be judges and be elected to Congress and have businesses that were not interfered with or trampled on by the resentment of local Southern whites. That only lasted for nearly 15 years. The Reconstruction period ended in 1877, and after that, in the immediate aftermath, we see in the post-Reconstruction era the rise of black codes, the criminalization of black life and black behavior. Any Negro found drunk could be charged with a fine, and if ultimately they didn't pay that fine, they could be thrown in jail. No Negro shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within a certain parish in Louisiana without being subjected to a fine or incarceration. Or in Mississippi, black people had to prove that they were lawfully employed, or that any person could arrest a black person or a mulatto, a person of mixed race. If they had left there, you quit your job and you can get arrested? That's ridiculous, but the reality is, if you think about slavery as a form of social control and the economic engine of the South, and you immediately take that away, what replaces it as a form of social control and an economic engine of the South? Well, one of the things that replaced slavery as a form of social control was lynching. It was a form of intimidation and bullying and fear to keep black people oppressed. But there was another form, and that was convict leasing. That exception in the 13th Amendment allowed black people to be criminalized and taken into custody and then leased out to these former plantations. There's a book by Douglas Blackman called Slavery by Another Name that talks about the rise of the convict leasing industry. And this is a picture from one of those prison camps where black men were arrested for violations of these black codes and then leased out to work and to labor. And it didn't end just with slavery or the Reconstruction era, because in 1896, the Jim Crow era began with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision that allowed state-sanctioned discrimination. Separate but equal became the law of the land. And it continued throughout with segregated housing and segregated educational facilities and segregated medical facilities and segregated or employment opportunities, or the denial of employment opportunities based on race. And this was just an example of the Jim Crow era, but Jim Crow did not operate alone. He had an uncle named Sam. You see, Uncle Sam's role in this cannot be overlooked. The federal government had a role to play in further oppressing and marginalizing people of color, and particularly black people. This is a map that is up, and it shows the Boston area, and it is a map of redlining, and it shows the specific areas where federally backed loans would not be issued to anybody, and those were the areas. And if you're familiar with Boston, that red section, that's kind of up around Beacon Hill, the South End. That's, despite what it looks like now, Beacon Hill used to be where the black folks lived. It's since changed. But if you look at that, this is the federal government's role in that. You think about the Social Security Administration Act of 1935, a compromise, again, with the southern states to allow this to be passed into legislation, required that domestic workers and agricultural laborers would not be entitled to Social Security benefits. When you think about who were domestic laborers and agricultural workers in the South, it was black folks. So Uncle Sam is deliberately excluding people. You think about the GI Bill, one of the greatest generators of wealth for an entire generation, because it allowed people to purchase homes or get education. But under the Jim Crow era, being able to purchase a home in a federally restricted location because of redlining limited your opportunities. You couldn't go buy a home just anywhere, and the place where you could go buy a home, you couldn't get a federally backed loan for that. And to the extent that GIs applied, or black veterans applied for the GI Bill, in some instances they were denied, and if they used it to go try to get an education, there was still legal segregation in the land where many folks weren't allowed to go and attend predominantly white institutions, and then would go to some of the historically black colleges and universities, which ended up in many instances being oversubscribed. And so this is the role that this country has played in suppressing and oppressing and disenfranchising large swaths of the community. And you think about the uprisings in the 1960s, and the Kerner Commission report examined the conditions that were existing in communities of color, particularly black communities, and you had high concentrations of poverty and high concentrations of poor economic opportunities and substandard housing and low educational opportunities. And you see the precipitating event in many of the uprisings, or what other folks would call riots, was the act of police aggression, beating somebody over the head or unjustly arresting someone, taking them away, and then they come back beaten and bloodied. And that was the moment where communities began to push back and resist in ways that would result in the National Guard being sent out. This was the conditions, these were the conditions that Dr. King was talking about, this tension that he had created in this speech as a need to be able to cash a check that would not come back marked insufficient funds. 50 years since the Kerner Commission report, and you wonder how much things have really changed. That's an image from 2015 from Baltimore, I believe. There was a recent study that looked at what has happened since the Kerner Commission report, and it shows that although there has been some progress, there has been a lot of setbacks or stagnation. 7.5% of African Americans were unemployed in 2017 compared to 6.7% in 1968, still roughly twice the rate of whites. The rate of home ownership for black people is just now over 40%, still trailing 30 points behind white families. And the incarcerated rate of African Americans has tripled from 1968 to 2016. So really have things changed much? You think about what some of the conditions are here in Massachusetts. I don't know how many of you all saw this Globe Spotlight series that lifted up the Federal Reserve study of the color of wealth here in Boston, and the median wealth of a white family in Boston is $247,000, whereas the median wealth of a black family in Boston is $8. And people had to double check that and say, wait, is that a typo? No, it's $8. And so when you think about the uprisings and the riots that were happening in urban centers, King once spoke on that in a speech entitled The Other America, and he felt compelled to talk about the rioting that was happening. And he said, but it is not enough for me to stand here before you tonight and condemn riots. I would be morally irresponsible if I were to do that. At the same time, I would be morally irresponsible if I were to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 12 or 15 years. It has failed to hear that the promise of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that the large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. These were the conditions that King was talking about, and there is this transition that happens because as a result of these uprisings, the Johnson administration had pivoted its resources and investments in the war on poverty to the war on crime. And you see a building out of the carceral infrastructure in America. And what I mean by the carceral infrastructure is a greater investment into policing tactics, the development of the SWAT team out in LA, Special Weapons and Tactics, which was the precursor for a lot of the policing tactics that we see. More resources into funding special investigation units, building out of the juvenile justice system, and the creation of more juvenile detention facilities, and the creation of more and larger prison institutions, and more and robust mandatory minimum laws coming onto the books in this area. One, as a reaction to some of the uprisings that were happening, because you think from the perspective of some legislators, we just gave these black folks the Civil Rights Act of '64, and we just gave them the right to vote in '65. Now all of a sudden they're acting up and they're being disruptive. So clearly it's not the social service programs that are going to be the solution, so let's double down on tough on crime practices. And the Nixon administration doubled down on that and ran off of that with the Southern strategy that provoked and invoked racist fears and ideologies. It sounds very similar when you hear Nixon talking about, "I am the law and order candidate." He said it. I like to put this image up when we think about the Bank of Justice. And, you know, whenever I give speeches or talk to folks, there's this concern that I raised slavery, and people are like, come on, that was so long ago. But when you look at the full trajectory of the experience of oppressed peoples in this nation arriving in 1619 or so, being under the bondage of slavery, not being liberated from slavery until 1865, the small moment of reconstruction of maybe 15 years, but then the Jim Crow era of segregation legally authorized by the government or by the Supreme Court, and until 1954, where the Brown v. Board of Education decision determines that separate is inherently unequal. But it still wasn't 1954 because full agency was not given to black folks in this country until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And when you look at that, there's just a mere 50 years of full agency and citizenship in this country. And you think about all of the denial and the deprivation and the diversion of resources from communities of color in this country, and we cannot act as if there is an equitable or level playing field that we are all operating on. And so I say to you that the Bank of Justice is not actually bankrupt, but rather America's account is overdrawn. It has issued too much justice to a small segment of society at the expense of too many others. And to make things worse, it's taken out a new line of credit on new technologies that will further ensure the most vulnerable among us are further ensnared. You think about these images of slavery, the convict leasing, to the current system of incarceration. It's interesting when you think about this seamless thread that runs from this nation's history, from slavery to mass incarceration. The Angola prison, the largest prison, or one of the largest prisons in the state of Louisiana, Deshaun, you can back me up on this, right? It's the largest Louisiana state penitentiary. It is on the site of the Angola plantation, named Angola because that's where the Africans who were enslaved there came from. Currently, the population of Angola prison or Louisiana State Penitentiary is 70% black people. You cannot tell me that there is not a thread that runs from this type of injustice to what we see today. And it doesn't end here because we're now seeing a decline in incarceration rates. But there are new technologies that are being deployed in our community with predictive policing, electronic surveillance, because the algorithms that are used to determine who's likely to commit an offense is based on the information that is included in the criminal legal system. Well, who's included in the criminal legal system? And who's being excluded from the criminal legal system? And what data is in there when you think about all of the wrongful convictions and all of the people who are held on truck-dump charges or overcharged in the system. And these are the algorithms that are being used to determine who is going to be the next offender or who is likely to offend or who is a flight risk. So if America's promise can ever be fulfilled, it must move its investments out of the investment bank of white supremacy that has leveraged the debt of genocide and slavery and oppression to yield profits for its greatest benefactors, and instead invest in a cooperative system that works not only more equitably to share wealth, but also proactively works to dismantle systems and structures of oppression. That is justice. And so we fulfill this promise. We fulfill the coffers of this bank by including and creating inclusive communities, by understanding and confronting and challenging and dismantling systems of oppression, systems of white supremacy, systems of exclusion and homophobia and Islamophobia and ableism. We have to confront those things, call them for what they are, and work to deconstruct them. We continue to fulfill it by bringing ourselves to a place where those of us who are in positions of privilege use that privilege. When we enter into a room and we look and we see that there are no people of color in the room, when we look and we see that there are no disabled people in the room, when we look and we see that there are no women in the room, what do we do with our position of privilege to create space for those voices to be present, for those voices and ideas and experiences to be lifted up? Those are the deposits that we need to make into the bank of justice. We continue to fulfill this promise. We continue to fulfill and fill up the coffers of justice by embracing Dr. King's campaign platform of the Poor People's Campaign, guaranteed income from everyone, health care for everyone. These are the ideals and the visions that he lifted up that undergird the I Have a Dream speech, that cast the vision of a reality of a world that we want to live in so that we are no longer chained and bound by the manacles of slavery that still hold us to this day, so that this check no longer comes back void. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Hall, for your inspirational remarks. Before I close, I would like to take a moment to honor a mistake I made earlier. I left out one of the committee members for the MLK committee, so I would now like to recognize Deolinda Branch. We will conclude today's program with the singing of Lift Every Voice and Sing. We ask that you join in, and don't worry, the lyrics are located in the back of your program. MLK committee member Heather Konar will lead us in song.
Please stand, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite Reverend Boswell forward to give the benediction, And after this, as you all are anxiously waiting, lunch will be served.
Knowing that I'm the only thing standing in between you and lunch, I will be very brief. Today, we have spoken words of justice with our mouths. We have envisioned the selfless agape love espoused by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in our hearts. We have dared to dream of his beloved community in our minds. Now let us go forth, letting our actions manifest our words, visions, and dreams of a better world. In peace. Amen.